Okay. Adrian Favell, thank you very much for coming today. It's very nice to see you again in the website. So, yeah, so we have a sort of a discussion with Adrian Favell. But I'd like to introduce Professor Adrian Favell briefly. The Adrian Favell is the chair in sociology and social theory at the University of Leeds. He's a leading international sociologist of migration, multiculturalism, and citizenship, with many books and publications in these fields. He's also author of Before and After Superflat, a short history of Japanese contemporary art, 1990 to 2011. And also he has published essays in Art in America, Bijutsu Impressions, Art Forum, and Art Tweet Online. Thank you very much, Adrian. So I'd like to ask you to give a short presentation and then have a sort of dialogue with you.
Yeah. So thanks, Yoshi. Well, it's really a pleasure to be part of this project and to be able to work with you on it. You know, obviously my research going back now to 2007 has you've been helping a lot with that research ever since the beginning, and we also share this kind of common background in sociology and cultural studies, which is interesting. I'm also very pleased to be part of the work around the Tokyo Biennale, particularly since the directors Masato Nakamura and Kazuko Koike are both figures, very important figures for me in the kind of story I tell of Japanese contemporary art. Yeah, we thought we'd kind of present this discussion between us as a kind of lecture that I give first to present some of the work that I've been doing since I published Before and After Superflat, to tell the story of Japanese contemporary art since the disasters of 2011. This was originally a talk that took place at SISJAC, the Sainsbury Institute in Norwich, and I've done it in a few places. But it is a kind of unpublished part of the original book, which I'm still working on. It's also part of also reflects work that I've done over a period of about 5 years with Julian Worrell, the architect, University of Tasmania, on a book we call Islands for Life, Art and Architecture in the Ruins of the Future in Contemporary Japan, and which again is trying to draw conclusions about the international importance of art and architectural trends in Japan in the last decades, and so the recent period, and trying also to offer an alternative view, perhaps to the more common view that internationally is had of contemporary art, particularly in Japan since this period. So here's where we start, and I'll come to Don't Follow the Wind in a little while. So the story that I tell is the story after the triple disasters of March 2011, the earthquake, tsunami, and then the massive nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And of course, this is I know, a very important topic for you with all the work you've been doing with collaborators with collaboration in Britain on the Art Action project, the context in which contemporary art has developed a kind of response to this, I think, is part of a more general reflection that has taken place in Japan about what the society might learn from these disasters, and I think very much crystallized by the architect Toyo Ito in his reflections about the disaster at the Venice Biennale in 2013, where he talked about how the disaster forces architects really to think about challenging all of the assumptions they had about post-war development in Japan and the course of Japanese society. And I think it's been a moment that has revealed all kinds of underlying concerns about the structure of Japanese society, the nature of Japanese politics, and the role of creative artists and architects and others in critiquing that society, in providing critical knowledge about that society, so that Japan can move forward into the future. And this really is a sort of key theme in the work that I've tried to develop, and it is an attempt to look at both the issue of the ruins, as it were, of contemporary Japan, that were kind of made extremely visible by the disasters, but also the kinds of reconstructions that artists and architects have tried to engage a different kind of social relations in the context of this. And it was summarized, I mean, lots of artists have reflected upon this, and I'm going to talk a bit about different examples, but summarized very well already at the Yokohama Triennale in 2011, just after the disasters, by the social artist Shimabuku, who put up this mysterious placard in the center of Yokohama, and saying this moment was really the chance for us to recover our humanity, to rediscover something deep and profound about our society that will allow us to change the nature of the kind of modern development in Japan. Now, Japan for me is interesting. It's always been interesting because of the what everyone refers to as the post-bubble era, and the fact that Japan experienced already in 1990 and afterwards a crash, an economic crash, and a societal crisis that in many ways was a forerunner for what happened globally in the 2008 crisis, the economic crisis of 2008. So if you think about the world being in a kind of crisis period since 2008, and we've had a series of crises that, of all kinds, economic, political, and now of course the COVID crisis. Japan in some ways has been in this kind of state of crisis, you could say, and since 1990. And this is an image of the Japanese economy like it was Mount Fuji, all the way up and all the way down after the bubble. But of course, it creates these particular conditions after this, after the bubble period of the 1980s, the exuberant overheating economy of the 80s that crashes. You've got a very different kind of society which has produced different sorts of creative responses, as well as wrestling with the economic, social, and political crisis that this caused. And the other dimension of Japan that's, of course, really fascinating and really important for the world as a whole is that it is a kind of pioneer society of post-growth in another sense, which is the decline of population and the dramatic population decline that Japan has experienced since, of more or less contemporaneous with the post-bubble period is a key reference point for demographers and sociologists thinking about what happens in societies that are chronically aging and declining in number. You also have issues to do with the difficult issue of immigration in Japan is also a very important part of this question, and also the fact that Japan is one of the most extremely polarized societies in terms of the differences between the urban centers and the rural peripheries. So I've spent a lot of time as well in recent years out in the rural peripheries, on islands and in regions where artists have come to work in disappearing villages, or working with aging people and so forth. I mean, for example, I'm visiting fairly regularly Yukinori Yanagi's project in Momoshima, and the Echigo Sumari as well, of course, is a classic example of this, which I've written a lot about. So we're talking about post-bubble Japan and the tracing what has happened since the 1990s. And originally my work was, it was very much focused on the post-bubble moment in the 1990s. And here it's worth giving you a little bit of autobiography, because in 2001 at UCLA, and when I first went to Los Angeles in 2000, I came across this exhibition that was taking place in Los Angeles called Superflat. I didn't know anything about it at the time. I had an interest in Japan, but not a particularly strong knowledge of contemporary art. And I discovered this show that was curated by a Japanese artist, Taguchi Murakami, of course, in many ways the most famous. I was presenting this kind of new and amazing pop art that was coming out of Japan in the 1990s to an American audience. And I think, like lots of people in Los Angeles at the time, was really amazed and enchanted by this show. It was just, for me, a perfect kind of introduction to contemporary culture in Japan. I got fascinated by it. And out of this, a project developed that eventually became the book Before and After Superflat. But it was a project about from a sociological point of view, about the export of Japanese contemporary culture into the West via Los Angeles. So Los Angeles is a kind of place where a lot of Japanese contemporary culture arrives in the West for the first time, and then it gets amplified around the world via Los Angeles. This has happened obviously with things like food, like sushi, happens in the film industry, happens with anime and manga, but it also was happening with contemporary art. And I was particularly interested in the fact that Taguchi Murakami and this other famous Japanese pop art artist, Yoshitomo Nara, had this Los Angeles story, particularly connected with Boom and Po. And so I wanted to trace that story. And that's effectively what brought me to Japan for the first time, was to trace how this particular phenomenon had become so important. You've got here an image also of Mariko Mori, who also, I think, has a particular kind of trajectory that takes her via London and then New York into the Western kind of contemporary art world, which was very famous in the 1990s. Again, presenting a certain sort of image of Japan that has become very popular internationally. And this is the image of cool Japan. And this is where a lot of our interest initially, our initial discussions between you and me, Yoshi, we had a lot, were events and discussions around the notion of cool Japan and the kind of the international branding of Japan through these kinds of contemporary forms of culture, and contemporary art as a form of contemporary culture that's kind of analogous with manga. For me, it was, obviously, I wanted to tell the story of Nara Murakami and Mori and how they became famous internationally, and it's partly a story about curators and the art market and the art industry, and how conscious of how the art industry works. And why he's interesting as an artist is because he theorizes how that works. But going to Japan and discovering about these artists, I quickly, in Tokyo and starting to work around galleries in Tokyo and meeting curators and artists and writers and so on in Tokyo, beginning to realize that this was only half the story, or there's a story here that had emerged internationally, but it had missed a lot of the most interesting things that had happened in Japan during the 1990s. And I mean, without going into all of the details, I focus a lot of the story on the kind of lack of international image in some ways of this other artist, Makoto Aida, and I've written, and I focus therefore on Aida's story alongside Nara, Murakami, and Mori as another dimension of the story that had been less visible internationally. And I try to understand why certain artists had become famous internationally and others had kind of remained only famous in Japan. Aida, of course, is extremely important, from his early works in the 1990s, as Amici here, to much later work where he's continued to be an important social critic and commentator on kind of some of the peculiarities and perversities in some ways of Japanese contemporary society. But that was in a sense one of the main points of the book, was to focus on his story. Now, again, I don't want to dwell on Aida because I want to go beyond the generation of the 1990s, but Aida, I think, is an important became increasingly important also after the triple disasters of 2011, because his kind of social commentary, this satire and kind of mocking, cynical, sometimes nihilistic view of Japanese society that you find in his work, I think became particularly appropriate as a kind of expression after the 2011 disasters, and particularly I think around the time of his big Mori Art Museum show, where he was getting a lot of visibility. You know, he kind of came into favor in a bigger sort of sense. But he's been a huge influence, I think, on the Tokyo contemporary art scene, and that's in a sense where I go then with this discussion in the post 2011 story. Obviously, the most famous example of Ida's influence are his, you know, literally his what I refer to in the book as Ida's children, the Chimpom art collective group, who've become, you know, almost like a pop group in terms of their kind of celebrity in Japan, and they've had a lot of success internationally, I think, also in channeling this kind of satirical view of Japanese popular culture as a kind of continual form of media provocation. Yoshi, you actually, I don't know if you remember, you introduced me to Chimpom originally when you took me to meet and met them, meet them in the show. And you know, at that time they were emerging as this sort of satirical voice of contemporary Japan. You know, projects like the Super Rat Project, chasing after rats in Shibuya, and of course, I think everybody was watching Chimpom and expecting great things of them, but they really did emerge, I think, as extremely important in the post-2011 moment, because they seized that moment to develop a very strong critique, I think, of Japan's reaction to the nuclear disaster. So the Real Times artworks, where they, you know, literally they're the first artists to go in, breaking into the Fukushima site to offer this very bleak commentary on what has been happening in the site after, you know, at the disaster and after. And then, of course, you know, other things such as the this amazing intervention they made it with in Shibuya Station, the graffiti work here. And you know, other works like the Ki energy chant, where they go up to the disaster zone and do this kind of absurdist chant about, you know, kind of a sort of attempt to kind of inspire Japan to respond to the challenges of the disaster in this way that you know, it's sort of a satire and a bleak commentary in some ways. And of course, this was all, you know, put together in the Don't Follow the Wind project. You know, here's the the non-visitors center that Kenji Kubota and Jason Waite, the curators, involved in pulling together with Chimpom and a number of other artists, installing works in the Fukushima disaster zone. And so this has done quite a bit of you know, had quite a lot of visibility internationally as a expression, I think, of this collection of artists responding to the disasters. So it's one very good example, I think, of work from that period. You know, a very good example being Kota Taguchi's finger-pointing worker, where a figure somehow allegedly connected to the artist breaks into the site and appears on the 24-hour video recording of the site. Taguchi, I think, has you know, been a very interesting archetypal type of artist of this period, you know, looking at issues of censorship and of the absurdities of kind of media and political issues around Japan's dealing with the disasters. And Taguchi, I think it's also is indicative of my methods in some ways, because he's like a lot of these artists that I've write about. I've had the very lucky chance and privilege to sort of hang out with them quite a bit and kind of get to know them individually and as personalities. And as a sociologist, I like to write about artists in their social context, and kind of, you know, also very interested in the kinds of careers and ways in which they generate, you know, kind of lifestyle around the work. And you know, Taguchi is you know, one of those artists that I've met through this work. What I do, I mean, just to kind of put this in briefly in a kind of art theoretical context. What I think is particularly striking about all of this art that we're talking about here, this socially engaged art, or participative political art that you're finding in Japan, and that has risen to prominence in the post-2011 period, is just how little it's known internationally. So here you've got a couple of examples of classic textbooks, art theory textbooks, collecting examples of socially engaged art, or talking about participative art. And if you go through them, you will find hardly any Japanese artists mentioned. I think Shimabuku is mentioned in the Living as Form project, but it seems like they were off the radar in many ways. And I think this is, you know, again, something that we've all collectively, and, you know, the people involved in this project have worked very hard to try and give some more visibility internationally to these artists. And yet they fit very well this debate, the classic debate between Claire Bishop and Grant Kester, which I'm sure all of your students are very familiar with, but you know, this debate about issues of political avant-garde art versus the you know, attempts by artists to become more like community social activists or workers that kind of get engaged in communities and work with communities in order to produce art. So do artists have to kind of maintain an autonomous stance where they're trying to break with the conventionalities of modern society and critique it, or do they somehow work with modern society in order to build art forms that are collective and socially engaged, I mean, roughly speaking, in this debate? And I think Kester's work is particularly useful as a way of contextualizing what a lot of Japanese artists are doing. Not perhaps Chimpom actually fit better the Claire Bishop kind of model. You know, they're more like a kind of external critique, whereas other artists have worked very hard to get involved in local communities in order to produce the artworks, and following kind of Kester's propositions. I'm sure that you'll be having a lot of discussions around the work of Koki Tanaka in this context. I mean, he's been the most articulate artist, I think, in terms of voicing a certain sort of vision in which contemporary art in Japan and the kind that he practices is able to create a certain sort of you know, moments of community, creating, you know, temporary social bonds, for example, out of crisis, bringing together people through unusual art forms, you know, collective events and so forth. And he's been very important, I think, in Reflecting Artists Guild, for example, the show that they put on at the MOT around 2016, I think. And as I know, Just in Jest is part of this project, and he, I think, has done, you know, did everybody a great favor with putting together this wonderful project that was published in Field, where a lot of the key people discussing the importance of Japanese social engaged art have published their work on this. And so this is something I was also part of, and I was able to write about Echigo Sumari and Masato Nakamura's 3331 project in the essay I wrote there about the pioneers of socially engaged art in Japan. But this is really obviously a key reference for everybody, I think, in this discussion. So briefly, we've taken about 20 minutes or so now, so I just want to go very quickly through a few of the other younger artists that I think might be thought of in this context, and what they bring to this discussion in terms of the actual work they're doing. You know, I took a great interest when I first met Ryoko Shiga, the photographer at the Sendai Mediatek, and this amazing show that she put on there in the aftermath of the 2011 disasters, the Rice and Kagen show at Sendai. I think it's 2012. Shiga's work is this kind of very eerie work where she works with people out. You know, she does a lot of kind of ethnological style research on local communities and myths and kind of traditional customs and so forth amongst rural populations in Japan, in the north of Japan. She did this project that emerging out of her work in Japan, in Germany. She studied this project in the north of Japan, in this particular community just near Sendai, just the south of Sendai, near Sendai Airport. And this is all before the disaster, before the 2011 disaster. She develops this anthropological kind of technique of working in the community. So it follows the kind of Kester type of line of work, sensitively finding how to work as an artist in this community to produce artworks, and then working with local inhabitants to produce certain sorts of strange works that reflect her own kind of aesthetic. These are the kinds of photography that she produces, and this is what she's known for in terms of the style. But the remarkable thing about this particular project, so this is the exhibition show at the Sendai Mediatek, was that while she was working on the project, she got caught up in the disaster because the village studio was completely wiped out, and a lot of her photography kind of gets kind of washed away in the work. And so she kind of becomes an emblem of an artist working in the middle of the disaster. And the show then takes place after the disaster, showing the work that she made before it and after, and bringing together as well the surviving villages to talk about the discussion, talk about the experiences and the effects that it has. So it's an absolutely crucial key work. There's a map of the location of Natori village near Sendai Airport. And so this is obviously one artist that was forced in some sense into an engagement with the post-disaster condition by working with communities. And I think you've then seen a series of other artists during this period also trying to develop different modes of working communally, working socially, in order to make a point about social dynamics, about mobilization, or about how collective responses to the disaster. So Tsubasa Kato, I think, is a great example. He's really, I think, has developed his work in lots of very interesting ways since then, since his early work. An artist who brings together groups of people to make constructions that in his earlier work, they used to pull down. So he'd go to some work in the Philippines, for example, meeting communities and getting engaged in the political activists, and they kind of create a simple textual work that is pulled over by the people. But his response to the 2011 was to do the opposite, in a sense. That is to go to one of the communities that had been devastated by the tsunami, engage in building, in this case, a replica lighthouse, one of the lighthouses that might have been swept away by the tsunami, and he gets the whole local community to pull this up into place. So it's a kind of communal effort to produce a collective artwork, and again, fitting the kind of Grant Kester type of idea. Now, I just very briefly would also mention in a sense, the other kind of trends I think that have been really important in Japan to do with an even younger generation of artists who have tried to find ways of continuing to do art and engage in art production and to support each other doing art, despite the incredibles in Japan. So you had the first Lots generation, in the sense of the people coming out of school in the 1990s, and there's all kinds of artists associated with that. And I think Tabaimo is a good example of a kind of first generation, Lost generation type of artist reflecting on Japanese society. But you've had several generations now of young people who've not had access to resources, who don't necessarily, find it very difficult to establish jobs, who have to struggle in the context of an art, the potentials for an art career in Japan incredibly difficult. All of the students that come through the art schools struggling to make a way. What you've seen then in this context is of art collectives of different kinds who've kind of emerged to organize themselves in certain ways. And the first by Takashi Murakami, but later they broke with a very voluble critical voice who emerges as this that I'd written about in the 2000s, this sort of intermediate generation that he was not impressed by after the initial 1990s generation. These are otaku kind of artists that have lived in a kind of collective form and produced work. So Chaos Lounge, the group, initially work very much in the kind of otaku style, also engaging, I think, with new technologies, internet work, taking images off the internet and producing work through internet types of images. And they also get very much galvanized by the disaster. So one of the key members of the group, Umezawa, his work, here the example, The Real, 2011. I was following Chaos Lounge, and they were doing this interesting work in Iwaki, one of the northern towns affected by the tsunami, putting on, kind of their own, sort of biennale type of event in the city. I put in certain younger generation curators. Kiki Kudo's work, I think, post New Future, a very important kind of collection that tries to sort of map out how the lost generations might go beyond this kind of immediate feeling of no future to imagine other kinds of futures, other kinds of alternatives at the future, and tracing it through, a figure like Sekai Kazuma, another even younger generation curator who's emerged on the scene, and he's been close to some of the figures that I'm mentioning now. So yeah, I'd like to, at this point, I'd also bring in I'd bring in the architect, kind of Kyohi Sakaguchi, who's another, I think, key figure, sort of spokesperson of his generation. And he trained as an architect under Ishiyama, Osamu Ishiyama, at Waseda University, but developed this kind of anarchist vision of Japan, first through his work on the 0N project, which is looking at how homeless people in Japan have developed their own cost-free ways of living, building houses and living off the system outside of the mainstream, and developing through a series of best-selling books his ideas, leading to this kind of notion of wanting to build an independent nation, seceding from mainstream Japan and creating a kind of utopian project that would be a collective response to the situation. So there's the 0N project. And this has influenced, has it had its own influence in amongst architects who've also been trying to think, I think Atelier Bow being a very important example of this kind of work, a sort of approach to architecture that also tries to think about the social dimensions of architecture, of how you create architecture that is appropriate for these collective forms of living, for independent living outside of the mainstream system, and so forth. So the Art of Nexus in 2016, which kind of traced this. And the share house idea is, which a lot of this is connected to, that is the idea that young people who are struggling to get by, this second or third lost generation, how do they live? How do they manage to live together? The share house idea is that you get together in a house, you save money, and you can kind of live a certain sort of life, low cost life that enables you collectively to all be able to sort of pursue your own creative projects. One of the wonderful examples of this as a kind of art project has been Shibu House, which I think it started in around 2008, founded by Keita Saito, here sitting in the center of the group, which is a house in Shibuya, so the most expensive real estate kind of area. It persuade somebody to rent a house to them where you've got young creatives living, some manga and anime artists and actors and so forth, but they're living in this kind of ongoing living collective art project in a way that expresses itself as the Shibu House. And again, this is a group I got to know and kind of featured, I think, as another example of this kind of these trends in Japanese society. There's me up. I'm there doing an interview with Keita as part of their House 100 project that took place at the Container in Tokyo. And it's a house that during this period has stayed open as a there's parties going on there. There's dinners, and they host visitors and so forth, and artists. So my final example would be the collective group Parplume, who are led by Yoichi Umetsu. And this again is an attempt by a small collective to develop a way of living under the difficult conditions of being part of this lost generation. He's himself, an established artist who decides to create this particular school around himself, and they live in this remote part of Tokyo, Sagamihara, which is a place with his old American air bases, and have created this kind of collective school that he teaches. And there's me visiting Parplume to talk about the projects, and here's an example of Umetsu himself is a successful artist who paints, and here's his work, kind of autobiographical painting referencing one of the classics of Japanese modernist art. And I think what's interesting about all of these collective groups, they represent this new generation, is that they've been supported and sustained in this context by Watari Museum. So Chimpom originally had a very important show at Watari Museum, and in 2007 Parplume were invited to live in the museum and kind of create their collective project within the museum. And here we have the talk show that they put on with some of the representatives of this new generation of younger art leaders leading these kinds of collective projects. You've got Keita Saito, Kuzuma, Sekai Kuzuma, Umetsu, and Yohei Kurose on the right, discussing these projects. So I think it's indicative of this kind of response of a new generation to the condition of living in Japan at the moment, and very interesting what it means as a kind of political voice of young artists. And I just mentioned in passing that, of course, sociologists have been interested in this phenomenon, and the share house phenomenon in particular has been written about by Tokyo sociologist Noritoshi Furuichi, pointing out how despite the gloominess and despair in some sense of being part of lost generations, this younger group, this younger generation come in communal happiness in some sense. And it's a kind of indicator, a good indicator, I think, of responses of the millennial and post-millennial generation, in some sense internationally. I think it fits in with an international vision of how the millennial and post-millennial generations have responded to the global crisis that we're living through. So that's about it. I mean, that's how I present the story. There's Shibu House again, and you can kind of find out more about my work through this link on Tumblr with my publications and so on, and happy to be in touch with anybody.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I mean, this was very interesting talk, and also it's good, actually, overview of what happened after the earthquake. I mean, I think that I really enjoyed your talk. I have a couple of questions. The first question is about the relation between this new movement and superflat. Obviously, the superflat movement represented by Murakami Takashi and Nara Yoshitomo are sort of a global phenomena. I mean, it's sort of the movement could be exported to Europe, America, but compared to that, I mean, this new movement is very difficult to export or globalize, very difficult to explain to those who live outside of Japan. How do you think about this sort of problem? I mean, the globalization or translation are very difficult in this movement after the earthquake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's definitely right that some aspects of Japanese contemporary art have always been difficult to export. So in some ways, Aida, Makoto Aida's whole career has been a kind of ironic reflection on his resistance to wanting to present himself as a global artist. He always wanted to present himself as a Japanese artist, and therefore have references, kind of forms of humor and contemporary references that were just really very difficult to translate. And he may, almost not wanting to make that effort, as opposed to obviously Murakami's strategy, which was the opposite, to try and take aspects of Japanese culture that he thought would work internationally. And I think, Chimpom, I think, have resonated internationally. So there's an example, I think, of a next generation influenced by Aida, who I think do kind of speak to some sort of, they do kind of manage to present certain aspects of Japanese political culture. Also, I think they have global interests. Their interest, it's a kind of transnational art in some ways that works. Is recognizable in the kind of context of Biennale around the world. I think Chimpom do fit a certain sort of kind of art that you can see internationally. And I would want to say that the younger generations I'm talking to, I do think that there is an international resonance for what they're doing, because they're living in, I think they're examples of kind of lost generation artists, survival artists, living in a post-growth condition, developing ways of working with technology and collective DIY spirit and so forth, which is a global trend. And I suppose the disappointing part for me is that curators and writers internationally have not put much time into presenting this sort of work internationally. So I think the problem might lie a bit more with it's very difficult to make some of these more recent forms commercial. I mean, that's really the bottom line. I think Murakami, Nara, Mori, Mariko Mori were all successful because they could be successful commercially in the art market nationally. Whereas it's obviously Chimpom are not a group that are working in an art market context so much, and these younger generations are it's more, their art is more a kind of form of life. It's a form of living, a form of survival. So it's interesting to sociologists, but not something you can put on sale at Sotheby's.
I think this is related to my second question, because the question is it's quite the project, our project is about how to create kind of critical discourses, or art criticism, or critique in general, right? But the thing is that, it's quite difficult to organize sort of language critiques of a new movement, because in a way that it's very you cannot see kind of practical criticism of this new movement, dealing with the collectivism or DIY lifestyle, or other kind of new form of art themselves. But it's also this is related to this how to keep distance from this movement when you look at them, because always this kind of art form, you have to be involved in a way. So it's hard for us to keep a distance when we discuss this new art form. How do you think about this problem? I mean, how you can locate the idea of the criticism of critique within this new art form?
I mean, there's a couple of things that I think maybe are interesting here. I mean, one is, I think, I've always felt quite comfortable with these sort of forms of socially engaged art in Japan, because I myself am working as a sociologist, as an ethnographer. And ethnography implies this kind of participation and involvement that means that the distance isn't really there. You're also having to be you're having to reflect upon your role as a writer or as an observer of groups, and kind of find your own position within it. That for me was always, the interesting part of doing research in Japan, was to try and find that sort of that kind of role within this as an observer, which was not really about critical distance so much as just understanding the social worlds that the artists are working in. And I think, I think there's a particular issue with Japanese art, which is that it's very Japanese contemporary and modern art generally has been very soft in its kind of political aspects. So we're very used to what political art looks like internationally, but I think from an international point of view, you look at Japanese forms of contemporary modern art, and people are saying, where's the politics in this? It just seems to be strange or too soft, or not really directly engaged. It's not really trying to articulate a strong critique in a sense. But I think this has been very well discussed, in the work of Reiko Tomi, and then just his work more recently, that you have to pay attention to the forms of collectivism and how artists work within collective as collectives within social institutions, in order to have that sort of impact and critical kind of distance, which often doesn't look like distance because it's very complicated to put on art in Japan. So, and I think that's something I felt is very strongly reflected in the philosophy of Masato Nakamura, and all the work he's done around 3331, because it's a hugely political project, but it has to be political in the sense of making it work in the context of Tokyo politics, and getting support, getting, just being able to do this kind of project in a city and put art on is itself a kind of political intervention, even if it's not always articulating a very strong political point of view. I don't know if that answers your question in some sense, but I do think I think the ability of a lot of artists internationally to criticize the world as if they are, political actors offering a commentary on capitalism, or offering a commentary on contemporary politics, is possibly, is exaggerated in many senses. And there's a sense in which contemporary art there's a lot of political artifice, I think. And this, of course, is the debate that Bishop and Kester are having in their writings. And I do think that's a very good guide, for students in Japan, for example, who want to try to think about these issues. I think thinking about that debate in relation to some of these examples of Japanese contemporary art is very instructive and very helpful.
Yeah,
Because again, they don't discuss Japanese art in their work, but Justin and others have tried to kind of use that to give us some insights.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it's time to finish. And thank you very much. It was nice presentation, and I hope to keep this kind of discussion anyway. Even under the this pandemic condition, so that at least Zoom is working, but at the same time we try to sort of keep in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it'd be great we can have more interactions with the network of people. It could be fun to have some online discussions.
I hope you to come back to Japan soon, but
of course, as soon as I can, I'm sure.